yeah, how do we begin to challenge something, a system that is rarely spoken about? So probably if you reflect on when you were growing up, so in your family, within your community, within the school setting, we find that racism is something that is not generally spoken about. So how do we begin to challenge these structures? And that's where we find that training, for example, is really important. And something that's been highlighted again and again by staff that attend our training is that they're keen to implement new initiatives. They want to speak about diversity and inclusion, but they're worried about terminology. They're worried about language. They don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to offend. So that's why it's really important to have spaces where we can talk, we can share our learning, we can share our good practice, and that helps to build confidence. So I do believe a lot of it is confidence building. We need space for staff, especially, to be able to develop their understanding of structural inequalities, even racial identity, white race identity. We generally don't talk about it. So it's just really fabulous to see spaces like this asking, what does diversity mean to you? Key area of work of our steering group is decolonising the curriculum. We aim to set up a community of practice, so we're hoping to hold conferences such as this, where staff can share their good practice and create new networks of learning. We also are really keen to set up a student co-creation forum. And we ultimately have to be representative of our student population. We now have around 25% of our students identifying as BAME, so that's Black, Asian and minority ethnic. So how do we ensure that the work that we're doing here within the university is representative of those students? How do we shine a light on knowledge, which has traditionally been viewed as holding a lesser importance than Western Eurocentric knowledge? And archivists have really been key to this work. So last year, the university published its historical report. They published its links with the transatlantic slave trade, and archivists, researchers have been really key into kind of providing a bit of a perspective into what was the university's role at that time and how have cities such as Glasgow really benefited from the transatlantic slave trade. So what does diversity mean to me? So I think diversity means to me being in a workplace that celebrates different cultures. This month in the UK is Black History Month. I think in America it is February, if I'm correct, yeah. But here we have it in October. So for me, what's really important and what shines a light on diversity is how do we celebrate other cultures and identities. We actually have something, I'm not here doing a sales pitch, but I thought you might be interested. In our university archives, we actually have a section dedicated to honorary degrees that have been given to Asian and Black academics, non-academics as well. So I thought you might be interested. If you have some extra time, you can take a look at that. Also, diversity also means acknowledging some of the painful elements of our past as well. And I'm sure that's something that's really key to the work that you're doing. And ultimately, diversity means something different to each person. So that's the beauty of having these spaces of working in collaboration with others. I feel that it's quite an international mix today of individuals here, which is so fabulous to see. So I hope you'll really enjoy your time in Scotland. Hopefully, we're also able to bring lived experience to the forefront of the work that we do. Strathclyde really prides itself on being a leader in innovation. And I think a commitment to race equality is essentially future-proofing the organisation, because as we know, our communities are becoming increasingly diverse. So again, how do we represent everyone in our communities and not just a select few? So it has been an absolute pleasure doing your welcoming address, and I hope you're going to have a fabulous day today. Thank you very much.
Hey everyone. It's great to be here in this wonderful community of archivists. I want to begin by giving a land recognition from back home. I acknowledge that the land on which I live and work is the ancestral homeland and traditional territory of the Monacan Indian Nation. I and my University of Virginia library colleagues pay respects to Monacan elders and knowledge keepers, both past and present. We also acknowledge and pay respect to the enslaved Africans, enslaved laborers, and free Black laborers who built the University of Virginia, as well as their descendants. That recognition actually ties into my topic because the creation of it came as a result from the inclusive excellence work that the University of Virginia Library undertook in 2010, 2020, and 2021. This morning, I'll talk about the library's use of the inclusive excellence framework to conduct an organizational self-study in an effort to identify strengths and deficits and changes that we need to make in our organizational culture, as well as where we needed to dismantle systems of oppression within our day-to-day operations. For my presentation, I'll give an introduction to inclusive excellence. I'll move on to the University Library case study, drill down into the efforts special collections and archives have made in conjunction with the IE process, but also separate from it. Then I'll shift to describing briefly what the current landscape of IDEA looks like at the university, and I'll offer some observations about the future work in this space. Before I move on, though, I'll say that I use the term IDEA more so than DEI. At the UVA Library, we've chosen to include accessibility in our DEI work and to make it visible by incorporating it into the acronym. It all starts with a mission and a strategic plan, right? That's what we learn in school. So for the University of Virginia, we have the Virginia 2030 plan, and the themes of diversity, equity, inclusion, and excellence are embedded and interwoven throughout the 2030 plan. As our president, Jim Ryan, is quoted when he introduced this plan, he said, "Diversity and inclusion aren't in tension with excellence, but instead are a means to excellence." The 2030 plan articulates an ethos that centers strengthening trust where it exists and building it where it doesn't. Living values and backing up statements with actions, and being a strong partner and a good neighbor to our surrounding community. So what is inclusive excellence? It's a model for organizational change. It's simple as that. The history of it begins with a grant from the United States-based Ford Foundation to the American Association of Colleges and Universities. AACU developed a program in 2005 designed to guide American institutions of higher education in identifying where their strengths and their deficits were in delivering a diverse curriculum to students. The Inclusive Excellence Program was also conceived to help diversify the student population on college campuses and to foster student success. The way to do this, according to the group who conceived it, was to link diversity to the institutional mission. In short, the original concept centered on academics and student success, and then grew to encompass the whole organization. AACU's Executive Director Emerita, Alma Clayton Peterson, encouraged the use of the IE framework as a way to assess organizational learning and to assess equity, diversity, and belonging at all levels. The AACU created a national movement with inclusive excellence. At its core, it's a model dependent upon collaboration, and it is used to affect change within an organizational culture. The framework consists of 5 dimensions or areas for self-study. The model addresses access, culture, infrastructure, scholarship, and community partnerships. It encourages goal setting across different contexts, from access and hiring to organizational culture, and it encourages the use of metrics to measure progress. The framework encourages accountability through the plan that comes as a result of the self-study. The 5 dimensions are access and success. And this is areas like recruitment, retention, development, and long-term outcomes. Climate and intergroup relations. This is what it feels like to be in an organization. It's about organizational behavior and culture and the impact it has on individuals and groups. Education and scholarship. This dimension is about the systems that have been built to support the ongoing operations of the organization. Community and partnership. This dimension refers to how we coexist in our community and how we engage with our neighbors. Although not an official dimension to the IE framework, I suggested that the library add a 6th dimension focusing on healing and repair for our IE work. And it was based on the University of Virginia's Racial Equity Task Force report called Audacious Future Commitment Required. The task force took a high-level assessment using the 5 IE domains, and they added a 6th one. And healing and repair seemed like something that we would want to address in the university library. The task force published their report in August of 2020, just a couple of months after the university library began its work on inclusive excellence. But it was timely enough to be very valuable and influential in our work, especially for thinking about healing and repair. Both of which happen to be very much on top of mind in special collections, conversations, and strategic planning. And so healing and repair for us deals with how the organization can deal directly with trauma, identify opportunities to disrupt harmful systems, and create new workflows, systems, and cultures that don't perpetuate harm. So our task force held its first meeting in June of 2020, and the university librarian and dean, John Unsworth, and I co-chaired the group. And we had representations from all departments in the library, and I'm so happy and proud that special collections had 3 members on the group, more than any other unit. 2 task force members per subgroup and dimension, except for dimension 6, which I took on by myself. And we held bi-weekly meetings over Zoom for 12 months, but we met in subgroups in between the task force meetings. The work turned out to be very intensive and fast-paced. We had a short turnaround time because we were required to deliver a report in May of 2021. So that was almost a year after our first meeting. The advice we received from the university's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion was to solicit as much participation from the staff as we could. They advised us to design an engagement plan for the staff and be intentional about it, aiming to gather information through multiple modalities. Our goal was to offer a variety of ways the staff could participate in giving the task force information about the library. We developed a survey, we held listening sessions, and we arranged for one-on-one meetings with task force members. We offered 16 different listening sessions over a 2-week period in January of 2021. We organized these by affinity groups in addition to general open sessions. We asked the same questions at every listening session, and some of those questions included, how do you feel about accessibility of the library spaces, both physical and online? Another question was, how can the library improve in developing a culture of respect? Still, can you provide an example of how the library could improve services to historically marginalized groups within our community? And what are recent efforts by the library to support inclusive excellence that the library couldn't build on? Other modes of information gathering included one-on-one sessions for folks who we felt might feel more comfortable talking with just one person. This mode afforded more confidentiality. And our third mode was to offer a survey, which everyone could take, even if they had participated in one of the other sessions. Again, the questions were the same on the survey as they were on the other two modes. Following the information gathering period, each subgroup took the information that corresponded to their domain and drafted a section of the report, which was due in March and early April. The dean wrote the introductory matter, and we all worked on the final report, which we did deliver in May of 21. So for domain one, some of the recommendations focused on hiring and retention. Let's get people, a diverse group of staff in the door, but we really need to work hard on retaining them once they're with us. For domain two, climate and intergroup relations, we focused on changing library culture to one which emphasizes respect, empowerment, and encouragement. We placed a premium on feelings and welcome, not only for staff, but also for anyone who would enter our spaces. For education and scholarship, we focused on engaging underserved communities on campus and in the Charlottesville community. And for infrastructure and investment, we focused on making our physical and online spaces accessible and welcoming. Additionally, we identified a need to increase service to marginalized groups, and we decided we'd track our financial commitments to IDEA. We focused on buying local as much as we could, which is a big part of being a good neighbor in our community. And we wanted to make our resources available to the community, specifically our books and our electronic resources. For healing and repair, we focused on understanding the larger context in which the library is situated and acknowledged the legacy of slavery on campus. And we wanted to represent our community through design and art in library spaces. For special collections, we've been working on diversity, inclusion, and equity and accessibility that predates the inclusive excellence effort. I arrived at the University of Virginia in 2017, and in 2018, we began holding workshops and educational offerings for staff in special collections that focused on IDEA. One such workshop was Deconstructing Whiteness in Archives, which was developed by the American archivist Sam Silverling, and we held this, as I said, in 2018. I formed a cohort of staff who wanted to study trauma-informed archival practice. And we used the Australian Society of Archivists curriculum and worked through it together over a 6-month period. We recently began a second cohort that are studying the same training. We talked about dismantling white supremacy in archives using the poster that you can see here. It was created by archival educator Grayson Brillmeyer when she was a graduate student in the University of California at Los Angeles School of Information program. And in May of 2020, after George Floyd's murder, as one institution, American institution after another, issued statements decrying the murder, I organized a meeting of special collections via Zoom, because this was right after the pandemic started, to create actions that would make us accountable for dismantling systemic racist structures in our archival practice. And we used Brillmeyer's poster as an organizing tool. At every monthly staff meeting, we checked our progress on these action plans to make ourselves accountable. And from that came the Inclusion and Reparative Action Plan, or IRAP, for our archival processing and rare book cataloging unit. The goal was for this inclusion work outlined in the document would move technical services and special collections as a whole forward toward a reparative archive model that was promoted by Lael Hughes Watkins, an American archivist at the University of Virginia, USA. And she describes this as a repository whose voices through the creation of thorough, accurate description informed by members of the communities described in the records within. We've produced a trilogy of exhibitions that have focused on the joy and artistic exuberance of 20th century Black life and experiences in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the United States. And that follows the IE plan. We've written a new collection development strategy that identifies and owns up to the gaps in our collections. And we aim to use our available funds to fill these gaps. And we've inserted language and job descriptions that let people know what we're doing. We're working on a reparative archive. We continue to use variations of that job description. However, that may be coming to an end because all job descriptions are now being scrutinized for DEI language at the general counsel level. That's a very new initiative, and I haven't had any positions go up through this process, so I'm not sure how it works. And it remains to be seen whether the term reparative will be questioned. We haven't specifically used IDEA language, opting instead to use Hughes-Watkins term because it's discipline specific. No department can require diversity statements from any candidate now, but on the brighter side, the Inclusive Excellence Awards and Fellowships remain in place, and the Inclusive Excellence Framework continues to inform university decisions. Also, IE work continues in departments and units all over campus. But even with all the good work that's still in place, anxiety is on the rise. DEI officers around campus are nervous to see what the future holds for the work that they do. There are individuals and groups who are attacking DEI efforts around our country in higher education. And in some states, DEI is banned, and watchdog groups issue Freedom of Information Acts to track spending on DEI. This is a quote from the Racial Equity Task Force. The bad news is that structural racism is pernicious and persistent, and it requires that we commit to a level of intention and rigor that ensures our investments, policies, practices, traditions, and the landscape we inhabit cannot quietly reproduce past inequities. So we keep an eye open for those external forces we want to ban, who want to ban IDEA everywhere while we continue to work through our Inclusive Excellence implementation plan. Our goal has always been to operationalize IDEA principles and have an underlying understanding throughout our organization that IDEA work is every day, not just occasionally. Just a few reflections. Inclusive excellence is not the only framework to use. There are others out there. We used it because one of our top level administrators had used it at another institution. We need to accept that there will be barriers through negativity. People will be skeptical. Anything that you do will help. Some will outright be in opposition. There will be heightened emotions as people are challenged to face their own biases and prejudices and inherent privilege. So you'll have to just keep going and go around or confront those barriers. I'll end with a quote from Cy Wakeman, who is an American leadership consultant who concentrates on eliminating drama from the workplace. And I think this quote is perfect for this work, or at least we adopted it at UVA Library. DEI work needs buy-in from the top, and it requires unwavering commitment and dedication. And if this doesn't sit well with some, then they themselves have decisions to make. So they can stay in joy or go in peace. There is no third choice. Thank you.
So why the provocation? doing nothing is not an option. I wish to firstly honour prior catalysts of change, such as pioneering Black activists and publishers, Eric and Jessica Huntley, who fought for the civil rights we take for granted today. Their biography, Doing Nothing is Not an Option, is a call to action. Furthermore, after meeting Alia Hassana, founder of Black Curatorial Consultancy, I praised her courage and advocacy in decolonising initiatives, and she in turn candidly responded, well, I don't really have an option, choice, because of how this affects me personally. This conversation reaffirmed that doing nothing is rarely an option for countless people whose lives are impacted by the systemic injustices and other colonial legacy issues. Decolonising itself can have multiple varied meanings and approaches. In this context, I refer to decolonising as additive, not taking away from anything. Simply ensuring that everyone's story is heard, as well as tackling the human consequences of colonialism, the inherent balance of power and privilege rooted in our collections and everyday practices. I believe that to sidestep decolonising and avoid reckoning with our imperial past is to further marginalise the lived experiences of the numerous diverse populations we ultimately serve. As many of us know, critically re-examining our archives to learn from the past can be used to strengthen our commitment to tackling inequalities and embedding a greater sense of our shared, diverse and interconnected histories. In short, the histories that have brought us together. My own lens as an archivist is as a white, cisgender, working class woman, born to a Serbian refugee father and Australian mother. Please also note that the opinions expressed here are solely my own and not those of current or former employers. Even prior to 2020's global reawakening, it has been noted that decolonisation, debated in the sector for more than 2 decades, is now an ever-present part of museum debates and is increasingly part of museum action plans. It's also a continuous work in progress, vital to any anti-racist action, without which all equality policies are meaningless. We must interrogate not only archives, but whiteness itself, and deciding how and what is to be decolonised should be informed by those with lived experiences of its legacies. This also includes decolonising actions espoused by Stuart Hall, Jamaican British cultural theorist, about needing to go beyond mere recovery of histories and pose challenges to foundational assumptions of British heritage, including today's political isolationism, in that archives are crucial contested spaces that can be used to create transformative histories for multi-ethnic societies in the UK. So irrespective of workloads, there are many daily and achievable ways we can undertake to embed equity, diversity, inclusion, EDI, actions according to decolonising and anti-racist principles. I certainly don't have all the answers, made many mistakes along the way, but we need to embrace the need for ongoing critical self-education and continuous learning, instilling ethics of cultural humility and radical empathy. Another key anti-racism commitment is to increase workforce diversity, improve recruitment training, promote retention of global majority peoples in management posts, create safer workplaces by ensuring zero tolerance to discrimination. Also vital, offering alternative routes into the profession in what is still a 98% white UK archives workforce, deciding what heritage we choose to remember or choose to forget. Both critically revisiting collections and confronting our imperial legacies with honesty is crucial to these actions, and I'll explore them through some practical examples. Consultation on language is also key. I'm sure as you have, I've been informed by guidance like Alicia Chilcott's Protocols for Describing Racially Offensive Language, Carissa Chu's Cultural Heritage Terminology Network, and Archives for Black Lives Philadelphia Anti-Racist Description Resources. In a Bernardo's archival context, collaboration with social workers led to trauma-responsive safeguards like additional content warnings prior to records access for caregivers, post-access feedback forms, and participatory record keeping to amplify a child's voice. Increased accessibility and inclusion, as we know, can include everything from compiling intersectional blogs, guides on underrepresented histories, through to adopting non-Eurocentric timelines to avert repeated celebratory events privileging white male leaders. As a tool of empire from colonial record keeping, it's increasingly recognised archives and their theories are infused with racist and oppressive ideologies. We must challenge how we practice to disrupt this. But the biggest moral challenge that's facing us is being unequivocal and honest in confronting painful aspects of the past, where colonial violence, exploitation, and racism is intrinsic to the stories we tell as part of challenging the foundations of our existing institutional memory. In their paper Dismantling the Master's House, Iblin, Ramos, and Grant assert that addressing uncomfortable institutional histories is a crucial step towards any attempt of decolonising from within. Bernie Grant, pictured here, a man of many firsts, from fervent socialist, trade unionist, and anti-racist campaigner, became the first Black leader of a local authority in Europe and one of the first Black MPs elected to British Parliament in modern times. Bernie was intensely aware of those whose experiences are too often written out of history and was adamant that the present couldn't be understood without an honesty about the past. His archive, widely used by students and campaigners, reveal the vast contributions of multi-ethnic communities in history, such as the UK African reparations movement. Even archives seemingly unrelated to colonialism contain within them legacies of that time and have been used to perform legal searches and prove rights. At the Queensland State Archives and Aborigines Welfare Fund branch, I catalogue sensitive archives generated from oppressive legislation relating to Indigenous peoples, and that was later used to facilitate restorative justice claims for compensation for the historical underpayment of award wages. We implemented culturally informed protocols created as early as 1995 by the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Library Information Resource Network, ATSILAB. This was intended to guide libraries, archives, and information services in appropriate ways to interact with First Nation peoples and sensitively handle records relating to and involving them. So, how do we critically reflect on colonial legacies in daily practice? Most, if not all, UK archives have their foundations born of a world framed by race, empire, and colonialism. In critically revisiting our imperial past, it's therefore important to recognise our organisation's historic attitudes to race, as not acknowledging the lived experiences of racialised communities only serves to perpetuate the racism we seek to confront. Amongst the oldest items within Bernardo's ephemera collection, pictured bottom right, my former colleague, Hira Ati, discovered and researched 2 seals from the Levant Company, chartered under Elizabeth I's rule, the predecessor to the East India Company. Pictured middle right are one of 40 autographs found with the seals. And this autograph was penned by Sardar Iqbal Ali Shah, author and diplomat who arrived during the First World War to continue his education and hoped his writings on Sufism would enhance cross-cultural understanding between East and West in a world marked by colonialism. Along with numerous human lives dislocated by imperialism, colonial records have also been dispersed. So these fragments of empire must be looked at alongside other voices and archives to weave together a more complete picture of the past, of both oppressive histories as well as wider global and multi-ethnic remembering. Pictured top left, a commemorative certificate such as this was gifted to philanthropist Thomas Bernardo and many of his contemporaries at the time for their participation at Paris's 1889 World Fair. And at first sight, with its celestial imagery, seems only to reveal an innocent expose in global exchange of science, commerce, and cultures. However, another consequence of imperialism, not so widely known, is that world fairs, including in London, were extensively used right up until the mid-20th century to portray colonised peoples as subhuman in the form of displayed foreign peoples, formerly unquote human zoos. During financial hardship, Bernardo attended to bring his fundraising to a large imperial stage, where he displayed a model of his village home for poor and deprived girls. At the same time, so-called model villages of Indigenous peoples, oppressively uprooted from their homes, were displayed in a dehumanising manner to propel imperial propaganda campaigns that weaponized and projected myths of racist hierarchies and white supremacist notions of inferior versus superior onto a global stage. World exhibitions were at the heart of mass Victorian appeal and widely attended by millions. This mass exposure to racist ideologies over an extended period shows how deeply and historically rooted the racist attitudes are that persist to the present day, and how common items like this, found across many archives, can bring to light what is often hidden in plain sight. Archives are increasingly committed to embedding new practices, which revisit their historic collections to look at whose voices we can and can't access through the archives, and recovering and highlighting voices who are absent, silenced, or obscured by the nature of colonialism. It only takes a little knowledge, time, and dedication to promote a shared, diverse, and intersectional history that's meaningful for all of us. Whilst at SOAS, we led a targeted outreach day called Finding Your Story in Madagascar to revisit the collections in collaboration with the Anglo-Malagasy Society. And this was to open up our colonial and missionary collections of Madagascar, to actively invite diverse and competing voices into the archives, displaying a cross-section of Malagasy subjects, themes, events, and formats. And there was a real exciting community reaction to the Madagascar archives, from someone reading a file on historic nationalist and student movements, of which they'd been at the forefront, to significantly for cultural renewal, an attendee rediscovering the origins of an Islamic tradition in a missionary's rare book, lost across generations, and which she could now remind her grandmother of, was one of the last surviving minority ethnic group in Madagascar's Central Highlands. So it's our responsibility to proactively ensure that the same archives used to dislocate and oppress are turned on their head and harnessed to play a restorative and healing role in honestly connecting past with present and empowering people for the future, and simply by inviting multivocal and critical reflection on what was never truly hidden. There is extensive evidence throughout UK archives of a long-standing multi-ethnic presence of people who arrived due to legacies of slavery, empire, migration, sea and trade, ever more affirming of the oft-quoted saying by Sivananda, "We are here because you were there." Similarly, author Satnam Sangera has rightly noted that the fundamental reason we are a multicultural society today is because we had an empire. Throughout its vast array of archives, Barnardo's reveals how, along with its darker history of forced child migration schemes, it also took in many children from global majority backgrounds from across the world. The children of empire who have shaped the multi-ethnic Britain we see today, and whose many individual migration stories are yet to be told within a wider imperial and global context. It's thanks to Professor Carolyn Bressing's pioneering research using photographic archives to recuperate Black Victorian histories that Barnardo's has gained a greater understanding of the archive's value for building more rounded awareness of our long-standing multi-ethnic past and how this impacts on our shared identity today. This reliance on the photograph, though, was often due to the inherent limitations within the written records of British archives, as it wasn't until 1991 that the census first recorded a person's ethnic group. And Professor Bressing further explains, I quote, "The imagined whiteness of our national archives is one of the most blatant examples of the whitening of Britishness. It should no longer be accepted in such a simplistic form." Whilst at Barnardo's, Hira Atik created a blog on Claudius Tiberius Alexandrinus, pictured top right, and using a decolonising approach drawn from Professor Bressing's research to show how you can move beyond isolated biographies and white paternalistic narratives, revealing interconnected histories, local to global links, and what this teaches us about our shared and diverse past. From the age of 18, Claudius journeyed from the Caribbean to Liverpool during the 1880s, initially employed by the Seneca servants, and later making his way to London, where he encountered the strangest home for Asiatics, Africans, and South Sea Islanders. Following this, Barnardo's welcomed Claudius into what was Barnardo's youth labour house, where it was noted no other door open to him, and where it's also reported no fewer than 14 languages were spoken there. Claudius courageously forged a new life in the face of rising racist ideologies in Victorian Britain, eventually journeying home to the Caribbean. Prince Ade Akitoye, picture bottom right, descended from Lagos's ancient ruling houses, pioneer in his own right, who established Nigeria's Green Triangle Hostel for orphans and destitutes in 1941, before visiting Barbados to explore methods for making homes for homeless children. As a politician and entrepreneur, he was the first Nigerian to study social science in a British university and advocated for change leading to the formation of Lagos's welfare state. To truly decolonise, archives must be read against their grain by multiple voices to help unlock unanswered questions. Local Roots, Global Roots was an allied and collaborative project between the Legacies of British Slave Ownership Project at UCL and Hackney Museum and Archives. All UK archives reveal many undiscovered links between local and wider global stories. As this quote from the project concludes, in thinking about the local and global together, we can begin to understand, appreciate, and value our shared history. To this end, the project explored the history of slavery, abolition, and long-standing Black presence in Hackney, evidenced in local parish records containing the earliest known occurrence of a Black person living in Hackney, 1630, to the legacies of African enslavement in Hackney, such as Joanne Vassabrona, daughter of well-known African abolitionist Alala Ikwiana, Gustavus Vassa, who was buried in Hackney's Abbey Park Cemetery. The African presence can be contrasted with the prevalent number of local and so-called absentee slave owners whose names are still etched in Hackney's local landscape and street names. The legacies of colonialism and slavery are everywhere, if only we choose to look. Upon reading Thomas Bernardo's biography by Julian Wagner and confirmed by UCL's Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, I discovered his wife, Siri Elmsley, was from a large family of enslavers embedded in Victorian bourgeois society. Her own father, William Elmsley of Lloyds, was chairman of one of the largest underwriters of slave bosses, all beneficiaries of the 20 million tax-funded compensation granted by the UK government in 1833 and paid out until as recently as 2015. However, being honest about our shared history also involves holding a mirror up to ourselves, no matter how unflattering the image. Due to my Australian, Serbian and Irish refugee ancestry, I thought I'd be safe from any implication in the evils of slavery. But a recent ancestry DNA test led me to the revelation that 10 generations ago, I'm in some way related to a former governor of Barbados, Humphrey Baldwin, who helped to formulate the 1661 Barbados Slave Code and Britain's first slave plantation model, spreading and leading to the chattel enslavement of millions of African peoples, an ill-gotten wealth generation upon which the British economy would be based. In other words, an active example my family had in the traumatic legacies people are now fighting against. Finally, if we're to critically examine the legacies of enslavement through decolonising lens, we must also acknowledge the long stretch of pre-colonial African history, as well as extensive sustained resistance of enslaved African freedom fighters, such as Samuel Sharp, whose sacrifice is less widely known than white abolitionists. At Hackney Archives and Museum, I was involved in a dedicated project called Changing Faces, Hidden Stories, which drew on the visual archive of a local photo studio, R.A. Gibson, reflecting Hackney's many diverse communities. It was externally funded by his Mayfairburn Collections Fund to encourage innovation, with many EDI and decolonising principles at its heart, including efforts towards more equitable partnerships, a community advisory panel, skills exchange, building a more inclusive organisational culture, and new participatory practices through revisiting archive workshops, ultimately to embed a greater sense of our shared, interconnected and diverse histories. The archives often hosted events with support from global majority-led consultancies that opened up the archives for experimental revisiting, reinterpretation with intersection and diverse communities, and linked to themed events, both formal and informal, with music to boot. Connections also made between collections and the anti-racism history of the archive building itself, named after Trinidadian writer and political activist C.L.R. James. Many people still tightly cling to rigid notions of tradition and preservation of national heritage in a way that excludes rather than includes the UK's diverse populations. In his article, Heritage, Stuart Hall notes, the national heritage is a powerful source of such meanings. It followed that those who cannot see themselves reflected in its mirror cannot properly belong. It's vital that we challenge some of these hello practices by making space, decentering ourselves, mentoring, power sharing, and whereas Trudy Mensah says, sharing itself is a form of resistance. Let's avoid gatekeeping, not be limited by what we perceive as our archive. Listen to a diversity of voices. Learn to sit with feeling uncomfortable and examining ourselves and our histories. Challenge Eurocentric frameworks, ensure our practices are reparative, adopt dismantling white supremacy and archives actions, encourage co-curation and participatory practices, and proactively fill gaps like redressing cataloguing biases and omissions. My colleague at Royal Museums Greenwich, Catherine Oxley, made an exciting discovery regarding Marcus Garvey, an African civil rights leader, in the form of letters written by him to a vice admiral. In a related blog, she notes, collections will often include a bundle of miscellaneous papers covering various topics. Only one or two of them will be highlighted in the catalogue, and this can lead to manuscripts of great significance being, I quote, hidden in archives. Also crucial are counter-narratives and creative interventions, such as the Museums of Queer History Club producing vital reimaginings of the archives, and the Seeing Ourselves podcast hosted by artist Sharon Walcott, revisiting collections by asking guests if they see themselves represented or misrepresented in museum spaces. Stuart Hall rightly points out amongst the many challenges we face in creating a more culturally diverse, socially just, equal and inclusive society, that an equally powerful is the deep institutional investment which the key organisations have in going on doing things in the ways in which they've always been done, and the operational inertia militating against key professions, re-examining their criteria of judgment and their gatekeeping practices from scratch, and trying to shift the habits of a professional lifetime. Quite a quote. There's also the challenge Rachel Miner has noted, where the transience of projects associated with Black history then is a sharp relief for those of white British history, and this will always create tensions, unease, and an imbalance of power. There's a challenge of a glaring lack of workforce, collections, and audience diversity. You need to question your own lens, recognise whiteness, white privilege needs to be named, uncovered, addressed, dissented. We need to build accountability in EDI and the DNA of our organisations. We're all very aware of pushback from within and externally remains acute, from discrimination and bullying to speaking out on EDI, FOI requests from the far right press, being made to feel EDI as an adjunct for your spare time and not core to your organisation. Quoting the UK's Museum Detox, a sector network for global majority peoples. For too long, the drive to make museums representative has been dismissed because of the threat of white patron who doesn't want to reckon with the legacy spending. Fear should not dictate at the expense of our civic duty and under the UK Equality Act to proactively address barriers to discrimination. There's also the current climate in the form of political isolationism, racism and far right, and finding the limitations of the curriculum. We're currently only teaching, for example, the rise rather than the fall of the British Empire, emitting a whole raft of diverse voices and histories regarding resistance of colonial presence movements. We also need to seize opportunities to decolonise and diversify throughout, challenge power in archives by opening dialogue, act now to recuperate voices. Authors Gibbon, Ramos and Bratt say, our colonial period material was created to glorify and justify colonial rule for private pleasure, to romanticise India, as a form of trophy. So countering this Eurocentric perspective is vital. Vasant Rajgul, a visitor assistant to the Royal Museums Greenwich, has proactively delivered nearly 100 talks on underrepresented histories, such as that of Devi Ahilyabai, a courageous 18th century queen of India. And again, where these everyday EDI actions, if you weigh it all up, express themselves as a movement. We need to engage diverse audiences, neighbourhood alliances. Nadia Swab is part of curating archives like Feminist Past, Presence and Future, and ING, was the first practice-based fellow enabled to research the archives on her own terms outside of traditional academic practice. And Stella Dadsey, pioneering feminist and writer, created the Maritime Museum's Freedom Fighters audio guide to highlight underrepresented histories of female leadership, resistance, and endurance. And lastly, we must harness the potential of the archives for a range of social outcomes, as well as embedding accountability so that EDI actions bring truly transformative change. In closing, Connie Bell helps us articulate the demand we should be making in these turbulent times if we're to leave behind a more just, inclusive, and equitable society, one in which we all feel we matter and belong. Archives offer a chance to bring our moral compass we should measure ourselves against and ask, where is my position? To bring unity, healing, reconciliation, and solidarity? Am I going to continue to be hesitant to address painful aspects of the past? Archives show a narrative of power, privilege, people in charge. So the histories of those whose views have been dismissed or downplayed need to be recuperated. How do we bring these into sharp focus? Archives are an open dialogue, and we want to provide opportunity. People are ultimately at the heart of living archives. Thank you.